I'm 87 years old now, and for 60 years I've been keeping the biggest secret imaginable. In 1964, in the mountains of Northern California, I found something that science says doesn't exist. His name was Marcus, at least that's what I called him, and he was a Bigfoot. I saved him from certain death when I was only 27 years old, and what happened after that defied everything I believed about the world. This is the story of how a young lumberjack became the guardian of the impossible, and why I finally decided it's time to tell the truth. Before I begin, if you like unexplainable stories and mysteries that challenge our understanding of the world, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any incredible accounts. And tell me in the comments, do you believe there are unknown creatures living in the deepest forests? March 1964. I was young, strong, and worked as a lumberjack in the Trinity Mountains of Northern California. My name is Thomas Reed, and back then I lived for work. The trees were enormous, some over 200 years old, and my job was to cut them down, process them, make sure they got to the sawmill. It was brutal, dangerous work, but it paid well for someone who had barely finished high school. I lived in an isolated cabin about 5 miles from the nearest town, Weaverville. That region was known for its dense forests, crystal-clear rivers, and of course for the stories. Stories of creatures in the shadows, giant footprints, nighttime screams that didn't belong to any known animal. But I never paid attention to those things. For me, they were just local legends to scare tourists. On the morning of March 17th, 1964, I woke up early as always. The sky was grey, threatening rain. I grabbed my chainsaw, my backpack with water and food, and headed to the cutting area designated for that day. It was a particularly remote region, almost 2 miles into the woods, where the trees were older and more valuable. Around 10 in the morning, while marking the trees that would be cut down, I heard a sound. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't birds. It was something different, a low, prolonged moan, full of pain. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, outside the work area. My first thought was that some animal was injured, maybe a bear trapped in some old trap. These mountains were full of illegal traps left by hunters over the years. I grabbed my rifle, which I always carried for protection against wild animals, and followed the sound. I walked for about 20 minutes, detouring around rocks and crossing small streams, until I reached a narrow ravine, and that's where I saw it. Initially, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown, almost black fur. It was lying on its side, one of its legs trapped in a rusty metal trap, the kind that was used for bears decades ago. But it wasn't a bear. The shape was wrong. The arms were too long. The hands looked human, only much larger, and the face. My God, the face was something between human and ape, with deep, intelligent eyes full of agony and fear. I immediately stepped back, my heart beating so hard I thought it would explode. All those stories, all those legends I had ignored, came flooding into my mind all at once. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, that was real. The creature saw me, its eyes fixed on mine, and for one eternal moment we just stared at each other. I expected it to roar, to try to attack, but no. It made that sound again, that moan of pain, and then it did something that left me completely paralyzed. It pointed to the trap on its leg. It wasn't a random movement. It was deliberate, intentional. It was asking me for help. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the rifle. Part of me wanted to run, go back to civilization, tell someone what I had seen. But another part, the part I'd had since childhood, that compassion for injured animals, that inability to ignore suffering, kept me in place. The creature was dying. Its leg was terribly swollen, infected. Dried blood covered the fur around the wound. That trap had been there for days, maybe weeks. If I didn't do anything, it would die there, alone, in agony. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Slowly, very slowly, I lowered my rifle, placing it on the ground, far enough away to show I wasn't a threat. The creature watched me closely, every movement of mine being registered by those incredibly expressive eyes. "Hey," I said softly, my voice coming out shaky. I'm going to help, okay? But you need to stay calm. Don't hurt me." I had no idea if it understood words, but the tone seemed to work. Its muscles, previously tense and ready to fight or flee, relaxed slightly. It nodded, a subtle movement, but unmistakable. It had understood. I approached slowly, each step careful, each movement telegraphed. When I got close enough, I could see the details of the trap. It was old, rusty, and the metal teeth were buried deep in the flesh. Opening it would be painful, but necessary. "This is going to hurt," I warned, placing my hands on the trap. "I need you to hold on tight." The creature looked at me, and then did something extraordinary. It grabbed a thick branch nearby and placed it between its teeth, as if preparing to bite something during the pain. It knew what was coming. I forced the trap with all my strength. The metal groaned, resisted, and then began to give way. The creature let out a muffled roar, biting the branch so hard it broke in half. But it didn't attack me, didn't try to push me away. It held on. Finally, the trap opened completely. The leg was free. Fresh blood began to flow from the wound, and the creature collapsed completely, exhausted by the pain and relief. Quickly, I took off my shirt and tore it into strips. It wasn't ideal, but it was all I had. I cleaned the wound as best I could with water from my bottle, and then wrapped it firmly with the fabric strips, creating an improvised bandage. The creature let me do everything, watching each movement with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. When I finished, I sat on the ground next to it, completely exhausted physically and emotionally. The reality of what I had just done began to hit me. I had just helped a Bigfoot, a creature that supposedly didn't exist. The creature turned its head toward me. Slowly, with visible effort, it raised one of its enormous hands and placed it on my shoulder. The gesture was so human, so full of meaning, that I felt tears begin to form in my eyes. "You understand, don't you?" I whispered. "You really understand." It squeezed my shoulder gently, carefully, aware of its own strength. It was a response, a thank you, the beginning of something I could never have imagined. "You can't stay here," I said after a moment. "Others may come, hunters, lumberjacks. If they see you—" I stopped, not wanting to finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen if it were discovered. The creature tried to get up, but the injured leg couldn't support weight. It collapsed again, making a sound of frustration. I looked around, thinking frantically. My cabin wasn't that far away, but how would I get something that size there? Then I had a crazy idea. There was an old storage shed about a kilometer away, used by the lumber company to store equipment. It was rarely visited, especially during the week. If I could get it there— "Okay, listen," I said, looking directly into the creature's eyes. "I'm going to get help. Equipment. I'm going to take you to a safe place where you can recover, but you need to trust me. Can you do that?" The creature stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, it nodded again. I ran back to where I had left my equipment. I grabbed ropes, a large tarp we used to cover wood, and returned to the ravine. Over the next 3 hours, with patience and immense effort, I managed to create a kind of improvised stretcher and drag the creature through the forest to the abandoned shed. It was exhausting work. The creature must have weighed over 600 pounds, and the terrain was rugged, but it helped as much as it could, using its arms to propel itself when possible, never complaining, never giving up. When we finally reached the shed, we were both completely exhausted. I opened the heavy door and helped it inside. The interior was dark, dusty, full of old equipment and stacks of wood, but it was dry, protected, and most importantly, hidden. I improvised a bed with old straw and tarps. I brought water from a nearby stream. I ran to my cabin and came back with food: bread, dried meat, fruits. I had no idea what that creature ate, so I brought variety. It accepted the water immediately, drinking as if it hadn't drunk in days, which was probably true. The food was more experimental. It smelled everything carefully, then chose the fruits and meat, ignoring the bread. While it ate, I sat on the opposite floor, watching. Even injured and exhausted, it was magnificent. Its movements had a strange grace, and its eyes— my God, those eyes contained a depth of intelligence that was impossible to ignore. "What am I going to call you?" I asked out loud, more to myself than to it. "You need a name if you're going to stay here while you recover." The creature watched me chewing slowly. I thought for a moment. Marcus. I'm going to call you Marcus. I had a friend in school with that name. He was strong, kind. I think it fits you. Marcus. The creature repeated the sound, not exactly but close enough to be recognizable. My jaw dropped. He had tried to say his own name. In the following days, I established a routine. I would wake up before dawn, go to the shed with food and fresh water, change Marcus's bandages, and then go to work normally so as not to raise suspicions. During lunch, I would quickly return to check on how he was doing. In the evening after work, I would spend a few hours with him before going home. Marcus recovered quickly, faster than any human would have. In a week, the infection had decreased significantly. In 2 weeks, he could put some weight on the injured leg. And during that time, something extraordinary happened. We began to communicate, not with words, at least not many. Marcus's vocal anatomy simply didn't allow clear human speech. But through gestures, sounds, facial expressions, we developed a system. He would point to things he wanted. He made different sounds to mean yes or no. He drew simple symbols in the dust on the shed floor. One evening, about 3 weeks after our first meeting, I sat with Marcus, and he did something that changed everything. He picked up a stick and began to draw on the dirt floor. First, he drew a large figure, clearly representing himself. Then he drew several other figures around it, a family. Then, with deliberate movements, he crossed out all the other figures except his own. "You're alone," I whispered, understanding. "Your family. They're gone?" Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes carrying a sadness so deep I felt like someone had squeezed my heart. He pointed to the mountains through a crack in the shed wall, then made a gesture of separation with his hands. "They left, or—" I stopped, realizing the terrible truth. "They died." Marcus lowered his head. The answer was in the silence. "How long have you been alone?" He raised his hands, opening and closing his fingers repeatedly. "Many years. Many years of loneliness." I placed my hand on his massive arm. "You're not alone anymore," I promised. "As long as you need me, I'll be here." Marcus stared at me, and then did something I'll never forget. He placed his hand over mine, that enormous hand that could easily crush me, and held it with an almost impossible delicacy, a gesture of friendship, of trust, of hope. The following months were the strangest and most wonderful of my life. Marcus healed completely, though he kept a slight limp that would never fully disappear. But he didn't leave. The shed became his home, and I became his only connection to the outside world. I learned so much about him. I discovered that he was incredibly intelligent, capable of solving complex problems, of creating simple tools when necessary. He understood concepts of time, could count, had exceptional memory. I showed him old magazines I found, and he would be fascinated for hours, looking at the images, pointing to things he recognized, making sounds of surprise at things he didn't know. I brought an old portable radio, and Marcus loved music. Classical music calmed him, jazz excited him, and he even tried to keep the rhythm by tapping gently on the floor. It was like watching a child discover the world, except this child was over 8 feet tall and weighed over 600 pounds. But keeping Marcus hidden was becoming increasingly difficult. In June 1964, the lumber company decided to expand operations, which meant more workers in the area, more people exploring the forest. The shed where Marcus was staying wouldn't be safe for much longer. One July evening, as the sun set and painted the sky orange and purple, I sat with Marcus and faced the reality I had been avoiding. "You can't stay here forever," I said softly. "It's too dangerous. If someone finds you—" I stopped, the image of Marcus being hunted, captured, studied like a lab animal, making me nauseous. Marcus stared at me, waiting for me to continue. "There's an option," I continued slowly. "About 10 miles north of here, there's a national forest area. It's protected, there can't be logging there. It's remote, dense. You could live there, safely." He shook his head vigorously, pointing to me, then to himself, then making our gesture for friendship. "I know," I replied, my voice failing. "I don't want you to go either. But it's not about what we want. It's about keeping you alive, free." Marcus was silent for a long time. Then slowly he picked up the stick again and drew on the ground. This time he drew 2 figures, one large and one small, walking side by side toward the mountains. "You want me to go with you?" I asked, surprised. He nodded emphatically. "I can't live there with you, Marcus. I have a job, a life here. But," I thought for a moment, "I can visit you regularly, bring supplies, check on how you are. It would be like being neighbors, only your neighbors live miles away in the forest." Marcus considered this, then nodded slowly. It wasn't ideal, but it was a compromise we could both accept. We spent the next week planning. I chose a particularly remote area of the national forest, a deep valley surrounded by steep cliffs that made access difficult. There was a natural cave that would be perfect for shelter, running water from a stream, abundance of game and edible plants. On July 23, 1964, we left together before dawn. It was a long, arduous hike, carrying supplies, navigating through rugged terrain. But Marcus knew the forest in a way I never could. He pointed out easier paths, warned of dangers, moved through the trees with a grace that defied his size. When we arrived at the valley I had chosen, the sun was already high. The place was even more perfect than I remembered. Isolated, protected, beautiful, in a wild and untouched way. Marcus explored slowly, examining the cave, testing the stream water, observing the patterns of light filtering through the tree canopy. Finally, he came back to where I was standing and nodded. It was approved. I spent the day helping him get settled. We brought some things from the shed. Old blankets, some metal utensils that could be useful, even the radio, though the batteries wouldn't last forever. We created a space in the cave that was functional and, in a way, welcoming. When the sun began to set, I knew it was time to go. I stood at the entrance to the valley, looking at Marcus, feeling a weight in my chest that was hard to describe. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," I promised. "I'll bring food, new batteries, whatever you need." And Marcus, my voice failed. "Thank you for trusting me, for letting me be part of your life, even if for a short time." Marcus approached and, for the last time that day, placed his hand on my shoulder. Then he did something new. He placed my hand over his own chest, where I could feel his heart beating strong and steady. Then he placed his hand over my chest, feeling my heart. It was a gesture of connection, of brotherhood. "We're friends," I said through tears I didn't try to hide. "Forever." And then I left, looking back repeatedly until Marcus disappeared among the trees. I kept my promise. Every 2 weeks, sometimes more frequently, I made the hike to Marcus's valley. Sometimes I stayed just a few hours. Other times, when I could make up excuses about camping, I stayed overnight. I always brought supplies, food, batteries, small gifts, books with pictures, simple tools. Marcus thrived in his new home. He gained weight. His fur became shinier, the glow of health returned to his eyes. He learned to live alone again, but now with the security of knowing he wasn't completely isolated. He had a friend. The years passed. 1964 turned into 1965, then 1966. The world outside was changing. The Vietnam War was intensifying. The Beatles dominated the radios. Civil rights, protests, social transformation. But in the deep valley of the Trinity Mountains, time seemed to move differently. In 1967, there was an incident that almost exposed everything. A group of hikers got lost and ended up near Marcus's valley. I was visiting him that weekend when we heard human voices. Marcus immediately panicked, his first reaction being to flee deeper into the forest. "Wait," I whispered urgently, holding his arm. "If you run, they might see you. Staying still is safer." We spent 2 hours hidden in the cave, barely breathing, while the hikers passed dangerously close. Marcus was tense, ready to fight or flee, but he trusted me. He stayed quiet until the voices disappeared in the distance. When they finally left, Marcus was visibly shaken. Not from cold, but from fear. The trauma of almost being captured decades ago, of losing his family, all came back. I held his enormous hand, or rather, I held one of his enormous fingers, and spoke calmly to him until he calmed down. "You're safe," I repeated several times. "You're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you." Gradually, over the hours, Marcus calmed down, but the incident scared me. It made me realize how precarious his existence was, how a single chance, a single wrong encounter, could end everything. In 1970, I left my job at the lumber company. After 6 years cutting trees, I couldn't do it anymore. Each tree that fell seemed like a betrayal to Marcus, destroying the world he called home. I started working as a forest ranger instead, a career change that surprised everyone who knew me but made perfect sense to me. As a forest ranger, I could protect Marcus even better. I could monitor who entered the forest, I could divert hikers from sensitive areas, I could ensure his valley remained untouched. It was the perfect cover. The 70s brought new concerns. The environmental movement was growing, and with it came more attention to wilderness areas. More tourists, more researchers, more eyes on the forest. I had to be even more careful with my visits to Marcus, but our friendship remained strong. Marcus was now in his mid-30s, I estimated, in his mature years. He had created a remarkable life for himself. He had specific routes through the forest he used for hunting. He had favorite spots to watch the sunset. He had even created a kind of calendar using stones and sticks to mark the passage of time between my visits. One of the most extraordinary things about Marcus was his mind. Over the years, I had taught him dozens of gestures and symbols. He could count to over 50. He understood complex concepts like seasons, weather, even some abstract ideas like past and future. Once, in 1973, I brought him an old Polaroid camera. I took a picture of him, and when the image gradually appeared on the paper, Marcus was absolutely fascinated. He looked at the photo, then at himself, then at the photo again. His face showed something I can only describe as philosophical wonder. He was seeing himself as others saw him. I spent that entire night with him, taking more photos, explaining through gestures and drawings how the camera worked. Marcus grasped the concept of capturing moments in time, of memories made visible. He kept those photos in the cave, looking at them frequently, especially the ones showing both of us together. In 1976, something happened that would change things again. During one of my visits, I noticed Marcus was acting strangely. He kept looking toward the more distant mountains, making low sounds I had never heard before. When I asked what was wrong, he drew something new on the ground. There were two figures, similar to him in size, but clearly different. One had features suggesting advanced age. The other was smaller, possibly female. Marcus pointed to the mountains, then to the figures, then to his own chest with an intensity that conveyed urgency. "You saw others?" I asked, my heart racing. "Others like you?" Marcus nodded vigorously. He pointed in the north direction, made gestures of distance, then touched his nose. He had smelled them. His species had an incredible sense of smell, capable of detecting odors miles away. "You want to go look for them?" He looked at me, and I saw conflict in his eyes. He wanted to, desperately. The loneliness of more than a decade living alone weighed on him. But he was also afraid to leave the safety we had built, afraid of the unknown. "Go," I said softly. "Marcus, if there are others of your kind out there, you deserve to try to find them, have a family again. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." Marcus shook his head, pointing to me, then to himself, making our gesture of friendship. "We'll always be friends," I assured him, "no matter what happens. But you can't live your entire life alone just because you know me. You need this. You need them." It took 2 weeks of conversations, of encouragement before Marcus finally agreed. We planned carefully. I gave him supplies for a long journey, maps I had drawn of the area to the north, even an old compass that I taught him how to use through patient demonstrations. On the morning of August 3rd, 1976, Marcus left. We stood at the entrance to the valley, both knowing this separation could be permanent. He placed his hand on my shoulder, our now familiar gesture. Then, surprisingly, he hugged me. That gentle, careful hug, from a creature that could easily crush me, but chose to be delicate, is a memory I'll carry until I die. "Come back when you can," I said, my voice choked. "And if you can't come back, if you find a family, a better life out there, then just be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." Marcus nodded, turned, and disappeared into the forest. I stood there for hours after he was gone, looking at the trees, feeling like a part of me had left with him. The following weeks were torture. I continued with my work as a forest ranger, but my mind was always on the mountains to the north, wondering if Marcus was safe, if he had found others, if he was happy. I visited his valley weekly, always hoping to find him there, but the cave remained empty. 2 months passed, then 3. I began to accept that Marcus wouldn't return, and although it hurt me, it also brought me peace. He had found his kind. He was no longer alone. Then, in the first week of November 1976, I returned to the valley for one of my routine checks and found Marcus there. He was sitting at the entrance to the cave, and the moment he saw me, he stood up and made a sound of joy that echoed through the valley. "You came back!" I shouted, running to him. "Marcus, you came back." He hugged me again and then, with animated movements, began to tell me, through gestures and drawings, about his journey. He had walked for weeks, crossed 3 mountain ranges, explored valleys I had never seen, and yes, he had found others. A small family, 3 individuals, living in an area so remote that humans would probably never reach it. Marcus had spent weeks with them, relearning what it was like to be among his own. But there was a problem. Through his drawings, Marcus showed me that the group already had its own social dynamic, its hierarchy. There was a dominant male who saw Marcus as a threat. There were confrontations, tension, and although Marcus desperately wanted to be part of a family again, he realized he didn't belong to that specific group, so he had returned. To the valley he knew, to the life he had built, to the friend who was waiting for him. I cried that night. I cried for Marcus's loneliness, for the tragedy of a creature so intelligent and social being so isolated. But I also cried with gratitude because, of all the choices he had chosen to come back. "You're not alone," I promised him once more. "As long as I'm alive, you'll never be completely alone." The years kept passing. The 70s turned into the 80s, then the 90s. I aged, my hair darkened to grey and then white. My back ached from decades of physical work. I retired from the Forest Service in 1994 at age 57, but I never retired from caring for Marcus. Marcus also aged. His fur became grizzled, especially around the face. His movements became slower, more careful. The limp from that old leg injury worsened with arthritis. But his mind remained sharp. His eyes still sparkled with intelligence and affection. In 2000, at age 63, I had a mild stroke. It wasn't serious, but it was a wake-up call. It made me realize I wouldn't be able to make that 10-mile hike forever. So I made a decision I had been considering for years. I sold my house in town and bought a piece of land adjacent to the national forest, as close as legally allowed to Marcus's valley. I built a small, simple cabin, rustic but functional. Now, instead of a half-day hike, I was only about 3 miles away. Marcus approved of the change. It meant I could visit him much more frequently, sometimes every other day. We established new routines. I would bring fresh groceries, newspapers with interesting pictures, new music recorded on cassette tapes that later became CDs. Teaching Marcus about changing technology was fascinating. When I showed him a cell phone for the first time in 2001, he was completely perplexed. I let him hold it, touch the screen, explore. He couldn't understand how voices could come from something so small. It was moments like these that reminded me how extraordinary our friendship was. Here was a creature of nature, untouched by modern civilization, being carefully introduced to the wonders and confusions of the 21st century by an old man who refused to give up on him. The 2000s brought new challenges. Technology meant that hikers now carried GPS devices, digital cameras, camera phones. The risk of Marcus being accidentally photographed increased exponentially. I had to teach him to be even more cautious, to recognize the sound of camera clicks, to hide at the first sign of humans. In 2008, there was a moment of real terror. A group of young adventurers with high-tech camping equipment set up camp less than a mile from Marcus's valley. They stayed for 4 days, exploring extensively. Marcus stayed in the cave almost the entire time, barely moving, barely eating, afraid of being discovered. I did what I could to drive them away. As a former forest ranger, I had some informal authority. I visited their camp, pretended concern about bears in the area, suggested better locations farther away. It worked, but it was close. When they finally left, Marcus was visibly shaken. It took days for him to return to his normal routine. That incident brought us even closer. if that was possible. Marcus realized, perhaps for the first time, how actively I worked to protect him, the risks I took, the lies I told. One evening, shortly after that incident, Marcus did something he had never done before. He took my hand, old and wrinkled now, and placed it against his forehead. Then he bowed his head, a gesture of deep respect and gratitude. No words were needed. I understood. In 2010, at age 73, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. It wasn't aggressive, but it needed treatment. During the months of radiation therapy, I couldn't make the hike to Marcus. For the first time in over 40 years, weeks passed without us seeing each other. When I was finally strong enough to visit him again, I found Marcus waiting at the entrance to the valley. He must have been over 70 years old now, old for his species, I imagined, but he had waited. When he saw me, he let out a sound that was part joy, part relief, part concern. "I'm fine," I assured him, though I was much thinner and clearly weaker. "Just a little illness. I'm getting better." Marcus examined me carefully, touching my face, my arms, as if checking for injuries. Then he gently guided me to the cave and made me sit down. He brought water, brought fresh berries he had collected, and stayed by my side until the sun set. "We're both getting old, aren't we?" I said with a tired laugh. "But we still have each other." Marcus nodded, placing his large hand carefully on my shoulder. "Always." The following years were slower, quieter. We both felt the weight of age. My visits became shorter but more frequent. Sometimes I just sat with Marcus, not needing to do anything, just sharing silent company in the way only old friends can. In 2015, something wonderful happened. During one of my visits, Marcus was unusually agitated. He kept pointing to a different part of the valley, making animated sounds. Curious, I followed him. There, in an area Marcus rarely visited, we found tracks. Large tracks. Recent. Definitely not Marcus's. He had discovered them that morning. There were others nearby, not in his valley, but close enough. Marcus looked at me with hope in his eyes. After all these years, after decades of loneliness broken only by my visits, could there be a chance that others of his kind were migrating to the area? We watched the tracks for days. We established discrete observation points. And then, 2 weeks later, we saw her. A female younger than Marcus, perhaps in her 40s, moving cautiously through the distant trees. Marcus saw her too. He stood completely still, just watching. Then she disappeared, and he turned to me with an expression that was pure, raw emotion. Hope, fear, desire, uncertainty, all mixed together. "Go," I encouraged gently. "Talk to her, carefully, but try." Marcus hesitated. After so many years of isolation, the prospect of interacting with his own kind was both exciting and terrifying. But finally, he nodded. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to leave signs of his presence in areas where the female had been seen. Marks on trees, arrangements of stones, the communication methods of his species. And slowly, very slowly, she began to respond. I stepped back during that time, giving Marcus space. My visits became weekly instead of daily. He needed this chance, this final opportunity for connection with his own kind. In December 2015, during a rare visit, I found Marcus with the female. She was cautious, keeping her distance, but she was there. Marcus introduced me through gestures, explaining who I was. She watched me with clear distrust, but didn't flee. It was a moment of bitter-sweet beauty. Marcus had finally found companionship of his own kind, but it also meant that our time together was naturally coming to an end. "Don't disappear completely," I asked him during that visit. "Still visit me sometimes. Still be my friend." Marcus hugged gently, carefully as always. Then he pointed to me, to himself, to his heart. "Forever," the gesture said. "Friends forever." In the following years, my visits became increasingly rare. Marcus was building a life with the female, whom I began to call Sarah in my own mind. They settled together in the valley, creating a shared territory. And in 2018, something miraculous. Cubs. 2 of them, small by their species standards but perfectly healthy. Marcus brought me to see them when they were a few months old. They were adorable, curious, playful, and Marcus was clearly a dedicated father. Seeing Marcus with his family, finally complete after decades of loneliness, was one of the happiest moments of my life. My mission, which had begun in 1964 when I saved a young Bigfoot from a trap, was complete. I'm now 87 years old. My visits to Marcus are few and far between. The hike, even the shortened version from my cabin, is too difficult for my old bones and tired body. But when time and health permit, I still make the journey. Marcus is now 80 years old, an extraordinary age for his species. He moves slowly, rests frequently, but his eyes still shine with that intelligence that captivated me 60 years ago. His children are grown now, almost adults, and are cautious of me in ways Marcus never was. They know only the wildlife, not human salvation and friendship, and that's right, that's how it should be. My last visit was 3 weeks ago. It was difficult. The steep climb left me breathless multiple times. But when I reached the valley and Marcus saw me, his face lit up with recognition and joy. We sat together for hours, two old beings who had shared an extraordinary life. We didn't need gestures or drawings, just presence was enough. When it was time for me to leave, Marcus hugged me for a long time. Then he made our gesture, hand over heart, one last time. I returned it. I don't know if I'll see Marcus again. My health is worsening, and the hike is becoming impossible. But that's okay, our story is complete. I saved his life in 1964, and he saved mine in ways I could never fully explain. For 60 years, I kept the biggest secret imaginable. I protected something extraordinary from the world that would have destroyed it. And in doing so, I gained the most extraordinary friend anyone could ask for. Marcus is still there, living in peace with his family, hidden in the depths of the Trinity Mountains. And as long as I breathe, I'll protect that secret, keeping them safe from the world that would never understand. Some friendships transcend species. Some connections defy all logic. And some stories, the most important ones, are those that can never be fully told. This is my story, the story of Thomas Reed and Marcus, an unlikely friendship that lasted a lifetime. And although the world may never know the complete truth, I know in my heart that I did the right thing. I kept Marcus safe. I gave him a life of dignity, and in return, he gave me purpose, wonder, and the deepest friendship I've ever known. These 60 years were the greatest privilege of my life,